On this dark night of history, there was a silence that screamed. Among the slave quarters, where black women were forced to live as property, a terror hovered. The moment when the master of the plantation walked in to choose his victim. It was not only slavery, it was the destruction of dignity, the kidnapping of the soul, and the eternal mark of a violence that crossed generations. Today, we will dive into the darkest side of slavery in Brazil, revealing truths that many tried to erase. You will understand how these abuses did not remain in the past, but echo to this day in our society. Stay with me, because this story is not only memory, it is a warning we need to hear. Colonial and imperial Brazil carried in its foundations the brutal weight of slavery. Millions of Africans were torn from their lands, transported in inhumane conditions aboard slave ships, crossing what was called the Atlantic trade, or the crossing of death, which transformed human beings into worthless merchandise. Upon disembarking at the ports, they were taken to slave markets, where men, women, and even children were displayed at auctions as if they were animals. There began a life marked by chains, pain, and humiliation. The slave quarters became the inevitable destination, precarious, overcrowded, and unhealthy spaces, where the night was divided between the exhaustion of work and the constant fear of new punishments. Black women, in addition to the burden of forced labor in sugar mills, coffee plantations, and big houses, carried an even crueler weight. Their bodies were seen as property, always available to the desires of the master and the overseers. Slavery was not limited to the whip or the wooden stocks. It also manifested in sexual exploitation, silent and daily. The pillory, erected in the squares, was the symbol of public violence. There, black bodies were displayed, whipped until they bled, to serve as an example of obedience. The whip did not wound only the skin, but also the soul. Each blow reinforced the idea of submission, that there was no escape, that freedom was an unreachable dream. But for women, the pain of the lash was added to the fear of the night. When the punishments ended, another type of violence began. In the big houses, enslaved women were forced to work as wet nurses, maids, and cooks, but they were also constant targets of abuse. The milk that should have nourished their own children was stolen to feed the children of the mistress. Many times, their babies were left to starve in the slave quarters, while the mother's body was used to sustain the life of the white elite. This structural perversity was part of a system that normalized complete dehumanization. The body of the enslaved woman was not seen as human, but as an object for use. It was a body marked by forced labor, by the sweat of the sugarcane fields, by the weight of water buckets, by the forced care for the children of the big house. But it was also a body vulnerable to the nightly desires of the master, who saw sexual violence as an extension of the power he already exercised with the whip. It was a body with no right to say no, no voice, no protection. However, behind this image of forced submission, there was resistance. Enslaved women developed strategies to endure the pain: songs, prayers, networks of solidarity among themselves. Faith, often reinterpreted from the fusion between African traditions and the imposed Catholicism, became a spiritual refuge. Even when the body was violated, the spirit sought a way to remain free. It is in this context that we must understand that slavery in Brazil was not only an economic system of labor exploitation, it was also a project of social, racial, and gender control. And in this project, the black woman was doubly enslaved by the color of her skin and by her gender. She carried the violence of labor and the violence of sexual abuse, being treated as both an instrument of production and of forced pleasure. This background helps us understand the depth of the night we are about to narrate. A night when the master of the plantation walked through the slave quarters to choose his victim. a night when terror mingled with silence, and when each woman prayed not to be the chosen one. And it is at this point that we dive into the macabre ritual that marked so many dawns of fear. When the sun hid and darkness took over, it was not only rest that arrived, it was also the time when absolute power manifested itself in the cruelest way. Because on that night, there was always someone chosen. When night fell over the plantation, the silence was not rest, it was fear. The distant chirping of crickets and the creak of the wind through the straw of the slave quarters mixed with the short, nervous breaths of the women. Each one knew that at any moment, the heavy footsteps of the plantation master could echo on the packed dirt floor. The moment of choice was approaching and no one could sleep. The master walked slowly, like a predator among prey. He carried with him the certainty that those bodies belonged to him. The women, pressed into dark corners, tried to shrink, as if the shadow could make them invisible. But there was no escape. The gate of the slave quarters was locked from the outside, and the only path left was that of submission. The ritual of choosing was not an act of desire but of power. The master chose his victim not for beauty or willingness, but for the need to affirm that his authority extended to everything, to work, to life, to the body, to the soul. Each time he stretched out his hand to point at a woman, it was as if he shouted to everyone, "I own you, and even your intimacy belongs to me." The silence of the big house reinforced this terror. The mistress often pretended not to see. Other times she transformed her jealousy into more violence against the chosen woman. As if the abuse from the master were not enough, the enslaved woman still ran the risk of suffering punishment from the wife, who saw in that scene an affront to her honor. It was a perverse cycle, victims being punished for pain they had not chosen to endure. And when the master finally decided, a mortal weight fell upon the slave quarters. The muffled cries of the women turned into desperate prayers. Some begged God to protect their sister, their friend, their daughter. Others in silence only hoped not to be called. But they all knew that the suffering of one was the suffering of all. Because, even if the violated body belonged to only one, the humiliation was collective. The walk to the big house was long and heavy. With each step, the chosen woman felt the weight of condemnation. It was not only the fear of what would happen that night, but the terror of what would come after. She knew she would carry the marks of violence on her body and her soul, that she would endure looks of contempt, that she might even be rejected by other companions who, moved by fear, distanced themselves. Rape in slavery was not an isolated act. It was part of the system. It reinforced control, kept women in a permanent state of terror, and weakened resistance. The master did not need to use the whip every night. The sound of his footsteps in the darkness was enough to remind everyone who had the power to decide over life and over death. Some women tried to resist. They fought with all their strength, screamed, scratched, and bit. But most of the time, that resistance was punished with even more violence. The master had at his disposal not only his own physical power, but also the support of the overseers, who did not hesitate to hold down and immobilize whoever dared to rebel. The struggle often resulted in beatings, days of punishment in the wooden stocks, or even exemplary executions. The pain of those nights did not end with the sunrise. Many women returned to the slave quarters in silence, with lowered eyes and wounded bodies. Others did not return. They were forced to serve in the big house for several days in a row until the master grew tired of them. Each return was a mixture of relief and shame, because while they survived, they carried the weight of something they had never chosen. And the cruelest of all, many times, children were born from that abuse. Children who bore no guilt, but whose faces carried the marks of violence. They grew up being reminded of their painful origin, rejected both by the big house, which did not recognize them, and by the slave quarters, which saw in them a reflection of domination. These children were sold at slave auctions, treated like any other commodity, reinforcing the cycle of pain that never ended. The nights of choosing were therefore a constant nightmare, a psychological terror that slowly destroyed the hope of women. There was no way to escape, no one to report to, no justice, only silence and the wait for the next time. And it is at this point that we understand that rape was not merely an act of pleasure for the master, but a tool of control and power. A calculated instrument to keep enslaved women submissive, weakened, and terrorized. And in the next chapter, we will go deeper into how this violence became a true weapon in maintaining slavery. Rape within slavery cannot be understood merely as an individual act of violence. It was, above all, a silent but devastating weapon used to keep the system of oppression functioning. While the wooden stocks, the pillory, and the whip punished bodies in public squares, rape secretly destroyed the intimacy and dignity of enslaved women. It was a form of control that left not only visible marks on the skin, but deep scars on the soul. The plantation master knew that his authority was not limited to the work in the sugarcane fields, in the coffee plantations, or inside the big house. To ensure that there was no rebellion, it was necessary that even the intimate lives of women were dominated. Sexual violence then became a constant reminder that there were no limits to the master's power. If he could choose any woman at any moment, it was because he was absolute. Rape also had a strategic function to break resistance. Many enslaved women who dared to defy orders were punished not only with whippings, but also with sexual abuse. The female body was seen as the last territory to be conquered, as if by violating it, the master demonstrated that no space remained for dignity or autonomy. Rape, in this context, was not born of desire, but of domination. The consequences were devastating. Women who already carried the burden of forced labor, of overcrowded slave quarters, of disease and hunger, also had to deal with the trauma of having their bodies violated repeatedly. This suffering undermined self-esteem, weakened hope, and kept victims in a constant state of vulnerability. It was a cruel way to guarantee submission without the need for daily whippings. The mere memory of the last night of violence was enough for fear to settle in. In addition, rape was used as a tool of economic exploitation. The children born from these abuses were automatically enslaved. In other words, each act of sexual violence could mean the birth of another property for the master. Many plantations grew in the number of enslaved people not only through the slave trade, but also through the increase in the enslaved population generated by children born of rape. It was the body of the enslaved woman being transformed into a factory of profit. Forced silence was an essential part of this machinery. The women had no one to turn to. The legal system of the time did not recognize sexual violence against enslaved people as a crime. On the contrary, the master had the legal right to dispose of his property as he saw fit. Reporting was not an option. Resisting was often a death sentence. Thus, rape perpetuated itself in the darkness, protected by laws and customs that legitimized it. The psychological impact also cannot be ignored. Sexual violence left invisible marks that added to physical suffering. Many women carried feelings of guilt, shame, and helplessness, even knowing they had no choice. Others found themselves rejected within their own community because the abuse, though collective, fell upon the individual honor of each one. This fragmentation among the enslaved themselves was yet another calculated effect of the system: divide to weaken. And we cannot forget the complicity of white society. While the masters abused, the mistresses often unleashed their anger on the enslaved women. Many black women were beaten, branded with hot iron, or sold far away, not for disobedience, but simply for having been victims. It was as if the punishment for violence fell upon them twice, first through rape, then through the punishment of the aggressor's wife. This use of rape as a weapon of power created a legacy that still echoes today. The objectification of the black woman's body, the stigma of hypersexualization and gender violence rooted in structural racism are direct inheritances of that period. Brazilian society was shaped by centuries in which sexual violence against black women was not only tolerated but organized as part of the slave system. And so we realize that rape was more than an individual aggression. It was a political and economic tool, an instrument that served to reinforce hierarchies, accumulate wealth, and perpetuate a system that saw human beings as commodities. A system that reduced women to silence, that forced them to carry in their bodies and spirits the memory of nights that should never have existed. And from the marks of those nights arose a new suffering, the children of pain, children who were born from abuse and who carried from their very first breath the weight of an origin marked by violence. In the next chapter, we will talk about how these children were treated and how their destiny reinforced even more the chains of slavery. From the abuses committed in the nights of silence and fear, lives often emerged. Children who never asked to be born, but who already came into the world carrying an indelible mark. They were fruits of violence, children of pain. These boys and girls were the cruel materialization of a system that used the woman's body as territory of exploitation. Their birth did not represent joy for the mothers, but rather another reminder of humiliation. When an enslaved woman became pregnant by the master, power was reaffirmed. Her body had been used not only for forced labor, but also to generate more property for the owner. Each child that was born was registered as enslaved, automatically included in the inventories as part of the estate's assets. There was no distinction. The child of rape had the same destiny as any other enslaved person, to live in chains, to be sold at slave auctions, to suffer punishments at the pillory, and to spend nights in the slave quarters. For the mothers, the pain was double. Beyond having been violated, they had to raise their children while being reminded daily of the abuse. Many times the child's gaze, the lighter skin tone, or the shape of the face revealed the unwanted paternity. These mothers loved their children but suffered with the weight of knowing that they were also symbols of the master's domination. In many cases, these children were torn from their mothers while still small and sold as if they were animals. The cries of desperate mothers echoed through the slave quarters with no one able to stop it. There was also the cruelty of rejection. The children of the master with the enslaved women were rarely recognized. They grew up in the midst of exclusion, despised by the big house, which saw them as a stain, and also by the slave quarters, where they were remembered as the result of violence. These children lived in a cruel limbo. They belonged nowhere. Their destiny was marked by exploitation. Many girls were abused even in childhood, repeating the cycle of violence of their mothers. The boys, in turn, were placed in heavy labor from an early age, carrying logs, cutting sugarcane, transporting loads. There was no childhood, no innocence, only a short life of suffering. It is important to understand that the birth of these children was not just an accidental consequence of sexual violence. For many masters, this was an economic strategy. Each new child increased the number of enslaved people on the plantation without the need to resort to the slave trade. The wombs of black women became, against their will, an instrument of reproduction for the system. Motherhood was kidnapped and transformed into a mechanism of profit, and there was yet another perverse element. Many times these children were used as a form of blackmail. Masters threatened to sell or punish the children if the mothers did not submit. Thus, rape did not end in the act itself, but extended into strategies of emotional control. Maternal love was manipulated to reinforce submission. The suffering of these children did not fade with time. Many grew up internalizing the idea that they were the fruit of shame. Some sought resistance, fleeing to the quilombos where they found shelter and freedom. Others were captured and punished with even more cruelty for daring to challenge the destiny that had been imposed on them. The legacy of this cycle of violence extends to this day. Brazilian society carries deep scars from slavery, and one of them is the stigma against the black woman and her children. For centuries, they were seen as inferior, as the consequence of a system that normalized sexual violence. This dehumanization did not end with abolition, but continued through structural racism and social inequalities. The children of pain are, therefore, silent witnesses of a collective crime. They reveal how slavery did not only destroy bodies, but also families, identities, and entire generations. Their stories are part of the memory that cannot be forgotten, because they bring to light the cruelest face of a system that transformed even birth into an instrument of domination. And if these children were visible marks of violence, what can be said of the women who, even without bearing descendants, carried in silence the scars of the soul? In the next chapter, we will talk about the silence imposed on the enslaved women, the burden of suppressing their own pain, and the strategies they found to survive the unspeakable. There was a kind of violence in slavery that did not leave visible marks on the skin, but slowly corroded the spirit. Silence. Enslaved women were forced to suppress their own pain. There was no space for cries of justice, nor ears willing to listen. The world around them pretended not to see, and this forced silence became as cruel as the whip, the wooden stocks, or rape. In the slave quarters, silence was a survival strategy. Many times, sharing details of a violence suffered meant exposing oneself to new humiliations, punishments, or even reprisals against family members. Enslaved women learned early that their words had no value before the law, before the master, and before white society. If they spoke, they would be accused of lying, punished, or sold. Thus, silence became a shield, though a heavy and suffocating one. But silence also had a collective dimension. The women looked into each other's eyes and, without saying a word, recognized one another's pain. They created among themselves a pact of unspoken complicity, where solidarity was transmitted through small gestures. A quick hug, a piece of food shared, a whispered prayer. It was a silence that hurt, but also united. A silence that spoke without needing a voice. This forced muteness was not just an individual choice, but part of the system. Rape and abuse only perpetuated because they were protected under the cloak of institutional silence. The laws of the time did not recognize the enslaved woman as a victim. On the contrary, they legitimized the master's right over her. If she tried to denounce, there was no court to defend her, no testimony that would be accepted on her behalf. The very legal structure was complicit, turning silence into the only option. Still, silence was not only submission, it was also resistance. Many enslaved women preferred to remain silent, so as not to give the master the pleasure of hearing their screams. They preferred to hide their tears, swallow their pain, and keep their heads held high, even if inside they were shattered. This silence, instead of signifying defeat, represented strength. It was the way they found to maintain some shred of dignity in the face of constant violence. The price, however, was high. The accumulation of unspoken pains turned into traumas passed from generation to generation. The silence of the mothers became the silence of the daughters, and thus the pain perpetuated. Many times, the child grew up without knowing their true origin, without understanding why their mother cried in secret or avoided certain gazes. Silence was a bitter inheritance, as cruel as iron chains. On the nights when the master entered the slave quarters to choose a victim, the other women remained in absolute silence, listening to the footsteps, the creak of the door, the muffled crying. They all knew what was happening, but none dared to utter a word. The fear of being the next, the fear of provoking more violence, the fear of losing their lives. It was a pact of collective silence, sustained by terror. Despite this, there were moments when silence was broken, even if in veiled ways. Many women transformed their pain into chants, into laments disguised as work songs or night prayers. The chants in the fields often hid coded messages of resistance, a way to communicate hope without the overseers realizing it. Thus, silence and voice mixed, creating their own language of survival. The silence imposed on enslaved women shows how slavery was not limited to physical exploitation. It invaded the psyche, controlled even the words, suffocated any attempt at expression. It was a system that stole not only the body, but also the voice. And by taking away the voice, it also took away humanity. But even in the face of this suffocating silence, some women found ways to resist. Their voices might have been silenced, but their gestures, their faith, and their solidarity became seeds of resistance. In the next chapter, we will discover these invisible forms of struggle that showed that even in the midst of darkness, the flame of freedom never stopped burning. If slavery tried to erase the voices of black women, it was also from those same women that one of the strongest forms of resistance emerged. It was not always open revolts or spectacular escapes to the quilombos, but daily acts, silent, almost invisible, that became weapons against oppression. This female resistance, often ignored by official history, was essential to keeping dignity and hope alive amid terror. Enslaved women resisted first within themselves. Even when they were treated as commodities in slave auctions, even when they were punished at the pillory or locked in the wooden stocks, they kept within their souls the certainty that their humanity could not be torn away. Many times, this feeling was expressed in night prayers, in songs that echoed in the slave quarters, in whispered words to children. Each prayer, each song was a way of saying, "Slavery may dominate my body, but not my essence." Motherhood also became an act of resistance. Despite so many children having been the fruit of violence, mothers fought to protect them, even knowing they could be sold at any moment. Many hid small amounts of food to feed their children. Others taught stories of their homeland, preserving the memory of Africa amid forced forgetting. Teaching an African song, a dance, or even words in the mother tongue was to defy the system that wanted to erase all roots. There were also networks of solidarity among women. When one was chosen by the master to suffer abuse, the others supported her upon her return, shared food, tended her wounds, offered silent shoulders to cry on. This collective care was the way to transform individual suffering into shared pain, lightening the weight that would have been unbearable alone. This gesture of support, invisible to the master's eyes, was in truth a powerful revolt against dehumanization. Resistance also manifested itself in small acts of insubordination. A pot of food prepared with more African seasoning than allowed, a task done more slowly to steal a few minutes of rest, a firm gaze even when the order was to lower the eyes. These were seemingly simple actions, but they spoke volumes. They still had control over something, however minimal it might be. Some women went further. They planned escapes, helped companions flee, transmitted secret information between slave quarters. Many participated actively in the formation of quilombos, taking with them not only their bodies, but also their knowledge about medicinal herbs, cooking, spirituality. In the quilombos, they were the guardians of life, responsible for keeping the community alive and strong in the face of external threats. Another form of resistance was spirituality. Many women preserved African traditions in secret, blending them with imposed Catholicism. While they prayed to saints in front of the masters, they silently invoked African deities. This double faith was a way to keep alive the stolen identity, showing that slavery could control the body, but never the soul. It is impossible to measure the strength of these invisible forms of resistance. They did not appear in history books with the same force as great revolts, but they were decisive for the emotional and cultural survival of the enslaved population. Each gesture of care, each song, each prayer was a silent cry for freedom. These women proved that resistance is not only fighting with weapons or breaking chains. Resisting is also refusing to be reduced to pain, keeping hope alive even in the darkest night. And it was thanks to this feminine strength that so many generations managed to endure the centuries of slavery without completely losing their identity, their faith, and their desire for freedom. But the scars of this invisible struggle did not remain in the past. They crossed generations and shaped Brazilian society as we know it today. In the next chapter, we will understand how these violences and resistances left deep marks that still echo in our reality. Slavery officially ended in Brazil on May 18, 1888, with the signing of the Golden Law. But for black women, the weight of violence, abuse, and rape did not end with abolition. The scars, left by centuries of exploitation, did not disappear. They were inherited, transmitted, and remain visible to this day in the social structure of the country. The violences suffered in the slave quarters echoed as a perverse legacy. The body of the black woman, which for centuries was treated as an object of labor and of forced pleasure, continues to be the target of stigmas. Even today, society carries marks of the hypersexualization of these women, often seen in a prejudiced way as naturally available, as if sexual abuse were inscribed in their history. This distorted vision is a direct product of the exploitation of the slave period. The structural racism that marks Brazil also has roots in this past. The exclusion of black women from access to education, health, and dignified work is no accident. It is the consequence of centuries in which they were treated as property. When abolition came, there was no reparation. There were no policies to reintegrate these people into society as free citizens. They were abandoned to their fate, often on the same lands where they had once been enslaved, now living as domestic workers in precarious conditions, reproducing the logic of subservience. The social scars are also revealed in contemporary statistics. Today, black women are the main victims of femicide in Brazil. They are also the ones who most suffer from domestic violence, from lack of access to health care, and from extreme poverty. This reality cannot be understood without looking back to the period when their ancestors were subjected to systematic rape, silenced, and exploited. In addition, psychological violence crossed generations. The silence imposed on enslaved women became an inheritance of pain that often remains present in black families. The trauma of sexual violence, of losing children sold at auctions, of social contempt, all of this shaped identities and produced a feeling of exclusion that still persists. Another important aspect is the inequality of gender and race in the labor market. Many black women were pushed into functions historically associated with servitude: cooks, cleaners, nannies. Not by choice, but by the imposition of a system that perpetuated the power relations initiated in slavery. This cycle keeps alive the hierarchies between big house and slave quarters, even if in new forms. And when we speak of social scars, we must remember that violence against black women is also symbolic. Their bodies were transformed into stereotypes, sometimes as sexual objects, sometimes as figures of unshakable resistance, but rarely recognized in their full humanity. This dehumanization has its origin in the nights when they were treated as voiceless victims, chosen by the master to satisfy his desires. The repercussions also appear in the way history was told. For a long time, history books silenced these episodes, preferring to exalt the cordiality of Brazilian slavery. But behind this deceptive narrative were the hidden pains in the slave quarters, the tears of mothers who lost their children, the marks of rapes that were never recognized as crimes. This historical erasure is, in itself, another scar. Yet it must be said that despite so many wounds, the resistance of black women also left a legacy. Their survival strategies, their faith, their solidarity helped build identities and movements that today fight against racism and sexism. The scars exist, but so do seeds of strength planted in the darkest nights of slavery. Thus, we realize that speaking about the abuses and rapes against enslaved women is not only revisiting the past, it is understanding the present. It is realizing that the violence we see today against black women is the result of a structure that began centuries ago and has not yet been fully dismantled. It is recognizing that the silence imposed on the slave quarters still echoes in the streets of the cities, in the rates of violence and in the glaring inequalities. And it is precisely for this reason that we need to give voice to those who were silenced. In the next chapter, we will talk about the importance of rescuing these stories, of honoring the forgotten voices, and of transforming memory into an instrument of justice and awareness. For centuries, the stories of enslaved women were silenced. Their voices did not echo in history books, their pains were not recorded in official documents, their names were erased. But each one of them existed, suffered, resisted. And today, it is up to us to listen to them. Because remembering is also a form of justice, and memory is the most powerful weapon against forgetting. Each woman violated in the slave quarters carried within her a unique story, marked by tears but also by strength. Even if their voices were silenced, their gazes, their songs, and their prayers are testimonies that crossed generations. The women who cried on the nights when the master chose his victim can no longer speak, but we can be their voice. Giving voice to these women is recognizing that rape and abuse were not isolated episodes, but part of a policy of domination that shaped Brazilian society. It is to say loudly and clearly that they were not guilty, that their pain was not in vain, that their resistance helped build the identity of a people. It is to restore their dignity, denied by centuries of oppression. These voices must be heard because even today we live the consequences of that violence. With every black woman murdered in crimes of femicide, with every young woman discriminated against by structural racism, with every mother who struggles alone against social inequality, the history of slavery makes itself present. Listening to the voices of the past is understanding the voices of the present. The chants sung in the fields, the prayers whispered in the slave quarters, the stories told from mother to daughter were ways of keeping alive a collective memory. These cultural expressions survive through time, and today manifest themselves in music, dances, religions, and traditions that carry within them the strength of resistance. By listening to them, we are not only appreciating culture, we are honoring centuries of struggle. The memory of enslaved women also invites us to reflect on what we want as a society. If we continue ignoring these voices, we will be perpetuating the silence that slavery imposed. But if we listen to them, if we recognize them, we will have the chance to build a more just future in which the body of the black woman is no longer the target of violence, but of respect and appreciation. These stories must be told in schools, in books, in films, in channels like this one. It is necessary to show that the Brazil we know today cannot be explained without speaking of the slave quarters, of rapes, of abuses, and of female resistance. It is necessary to break with the myth of a mild slavery and to reveal the harsh truth that shaped our collective identity. These voices also teach us about resilience. Despite all the violence, they found ways to resist, to keep hope alive, to transmit values to the next generations. Each prayer said in secret, each child protected in silence, each act of solidarity was a silent cry that still echoes today. Listening to them is also learning from their courage. Giving space to these voices is a political and social act. It is recognizing that there is no full freedom as long as the memory of enslaved women remains buried in silence. It is transforming pain into awareness, remembrance into struggle, the past into lesson. And it is with this call to memory that we approach the end of this narrative. In the next and final chapter, we will reflect on how all this history, marked by violence and resistance, continues to affect us today, and how the rescue of this memory can guide us toward a future in which no woman has to live what they lived. The story we have walked through so far has not been easy to hear. We have spoken of abuses, of rapes, of nights of terror when the master chose his victim, of the silence imposed on women, of the pain of children born from violence, of the marks that cross generations. But it is precisely because it is painful that this story must be told. Because forgetting would be to repeat injustice. The enslaved women had their bodies violated and their voices silenced, but their invisible resistance transformed pain into survival. They were the ones who, even subjected to the worst of slavery, found ways to protect their children, to preserve memories, to nurture hope. And that is why, when we remember these women, we are not speaking only of victims. We are also speaking of warriors who kept alive the flame of humanity. Brazil today still carries the scars of that past. Structural racism, violence against black women, social inequality. All of this is the direct consequence of centuries of exploitation. Each statistic showing black women as the main victims of femicide, each report of prejudice, each story of exclusion is an echo of the slave quarters. Slavery did not end in 1888. It left deep marks that still shape our reality. But by bringing back these voices, by telling their stories, we have the chance to transform scars into awareness. To recognize that the fight against racism and gender violence is not only a matter of the present, but a historical reparation. Each time we give space to the memory of these women, we are building a future in which none of them will be forgotten. This video is not only about the past, it is about us, about the society we want to build, about the commitment not to allow violence against women, especially black women, to continue being normalized. It is about breaking the cycle of silence that began in the slave quarters and that still persists in many homes, streets, and institutions. That is why I invite you not to let this story be lost. Share this video, comment your opinion, take this reflection to other people, and subscribe to the channel so that together we can continue rescuing silenced voices and revealing truths that still echo. Because memory cannot die, and justice begins when we choose to remember.